Hello again. Oh, sorry. The moment I switch on the microphone, I have to a big intake of breath. That's what you were all here for. So I'm really looking forward to, hello, this is like a royal entrance, isn't it? I mean, I'm in favour of deformalising most experiences, so if you want to leave halfway, that's fine as well. I don't think you will. As I said, so anything contemporary music-wise, we might not really know what kind of experience we're getting ourselves into. But I'm really thrilled that Leona asked me to come and speak about this show to you. I'll give you a bit of background of the show, the creatives involved, some of the plot, and talk about some of the quite unique politics that are part of this show. At times quite confronting politics that are surprisingly relevant in the last 7 days as well, which I'll touch on in a bit more detail. So I'm just going to start just with a quick acknowledgement of country, acknowledge that we are on traditional land, unceded traditional land. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and any First Nations people that might be in the room with us today. Now, in addition to the lands that we're meeting on today, I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the lands and waters around Adelaide, and specifically the Karawira-Pari, which is the First Nations name for the Torrens River, where the show is set effectively. It's set on that land as well. One thing that's particular to this acknowledgement is that as we will learn about Dr. Duncan, he arrived from the UK into Australia and was sort of met with laws that were not in line with his way of living, which is perhaps not dissimilar to aspects of the process of colonisation where people from the UK came here and met First Nations people and sort of imposed a different way of living and a legal system around those people. So there's a particular sort of resonance to the acknowledgement today. Oh, wrong way. So this topic, the show has confronting elements, as I said, so I think it's worth putting up a bit of a note. We're going to be talking about violence, quite extreme violence, which is not unusual in opera. For all of us that are familiar with opera, that's kind of bread and butter, but it takes on a particular tenor, I think, when it's something that is about a real person and also something that's so close to home locally. It's something that happened here in Australia and in the relatively recent past, where we're talking about half a century here, as opposed to sort of 17th century types of violence, stories from Europe in different centuries. So we're talking about murder as well. The show and some of the references that I'll make include strong sexual language and references, and the show itself also has explicit language. So there are aspects of the show that might be a little bit confronting. The show is also quite fun. It doesn't focus purely on doom and gloom. It balances lightness and darkness. So, a little bit of background. I'm going to provide you a little bit of background to the opera, the story that it's based on, and also the creative team that put this show together. And I think it's appropriate to start with focusing a little bit on Dr. Duncan. So what do we know about the experience, the event that this opera is based on? So I'm actually going to read from you an extract written by the Honourable Michael Kirby, who had written in the Adelaide Law Review an article called Dr. George Ian Duncan Remembered. And this is the first paragraph of Michael Kirby's reflection or remembrance. Dr. George Ian Ogilvie Duncan died on the 10th of May 1972. He was drowned in the Torrens River when, at about 11 p.m, he was pushed from an embankment, reportedly by a well-dressed young man. His assailant had approached him and asked, "How would you like a swim?" We know that his death occurred at exactly 11:07 p.m. because that is the time that his watch stopped, inferentially by sudden immersion in 3 meters of water. Another victim was thrown into the river at the same time by another assailant in a group of 3. He injured his ankle but could swim to safety. Dr. Duncan was unable to swim. One of the assailants stripped off his upper garments and plunged into the river in search of the victim, but without success. Later, Dr. Duncan's body was retrieved from the river, his long arms already outstretched, fixed by rigor mortis, protesting his fate. So this is the introduction that Michael Kirby gives to the horrific and quite confronting act of violence that took place in Adelaide 50 years ago, that became, as the opera claims, a watershed moment for gay rights in Australia. And what we see, and what I'll present to you in the talk today, is kind of two narratives existing at the same time. On the one hand, we have the quite personal story of Dr. Duncan, a man who was murdered, and the specifics of the case that happened to him. And alongside that, we have Australia as a country and South Australia as a state and its process of navigating the implementation of queer rights. And those two narratives run side by side in the show. They'll run side by side in the talk that I give today. They're interrelated, but there are discrete elements to the two of them. So the show puts forward the idea that this crime, or this act of murder, was a catalyst of sorts for gay rights to then spread across Australia, and in many ways was the first instance of gay rights across the world, or at least in the English-speaking countries. So I'm going to focus on a few different sources. The show itself draws much from Tim Reeves' work. Tim Reeves is a legal historian in South Australia and an academic who has written a book called The Death of Dr. Duncan, which was released 2 years ago in 2022 by Wakefield Press. Tim Reeves had also already published quite widely in academic circles about Dr. Duncan. Oh, we've lost our surprise slides. Oh yeah, thank you. And so, for example, he already had articles way back in 2016 in the Journal of the Historical Society of South Australia, Dr. Duncan Revisited, and some other articles. So he was already conducting this historical research, and I'll draw a little bit on both of these sources, as well as the opening remarks I gave from Michael Kirby, who has reflected on the death of Dr. Duncan from some other perspectives as well, and provided some additional thoughts on how the death of Dr. Duncan becomes representative of a few different things, queer rights, but also human rights in general, perhaps as sort of an eminent legal figure like the Honourable Michael Kirby is wont to do. So as I just said, the focus of the opera is on two main narratives: the death of Ian Duncan and the investigation of his murder, and the progress of gay rights in Australia, and specifically around Adelaide. So let's summarise a little bit of one of those narratives. I'm going to summarise in the show what parts of the life and death and then criminal case of Dr. Duncan the show covers. So we know that Dr. Duncan is murdered in 1972, and immediately 3 police vice squad members are investigated for the crime. They do not cooperate with the investigation to actually invite out from the UK 2 New Scotland Yard detectives. So they come to Australia and they investigate as somewhat impartial parties to review what's going on. And they recommend that there are 2 specific police officers that were likely the perpetrators. This is all in the same year, 1972 into 1973. And they recommend in a document to the court of the coroner that these 2 police are guilty of this crime and should be prosecuted. However, that report is sealed. There is no actual case brought against anybody in particular at this time in the 1970s, and it's not pursued. A decade later, other activities have happened around gay rights in Australia, but in the case of the murder of Ian Duncan, new testimony emerges in the 1980s, and there are now new witness accounts, perhaps as a result of a growing acceptance, I guess, of queer life in Australia. So in 1985, new witnesses emerge and say that they saw what was going on because they were also there at the beat. And they claim that it was specifically 3 men. There's an idea that maybe it was young people, and that was a way to dismiss any suspicion from the police officers by saying that they were young men, and the witnesses come forward and say no, they were mature age men, and they specifically implicate these 2 police officers. And the 2 that were originally named in that report by the New Scotland Yard are tried, but they are not found guilty, so they're acquitted of the crime. It's kind of this, now formally we then say they were not guilty of the crime. We end up in this weird place where everybody seems to know that it was them. They were named, they were tried over the course of a decade. But formally speaking, they were acquitted, which means that the case is unsolved. It formally exists as an unsolved murder case, which feels a little bit strange to say when we know so much detail about what happened and who was involved. So it's sort of a bit of an unfortunate sort of final cadence on this story to say that it's an unsolved case. But formally speaking, from a legal standpoint, it is an unsolved murder, but we know a little bit more. So that's one of the narratives that takes place in this opera and is covered. Something I'll return to a little bit later on is this interesting process we have to go through when an opera chooses to mediate reality. Opera, as we know, is kind of a specifically unreal form. It doesn't present things in a real way. And if we look at the history of opera, we see it kind of dipping in and out of this interest in the truth, for lack of a better term. And this opera, sort of very present example, it becomes sort of another example in quite a few hundred years of opera sort of doing this yo-yo with real stories. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Oh no, that's right. Oh great. Okay, so some specifics of the show itself. The show was written and premiered in 2022 at Adelaide Festival, appropriately in South Australia. It was recorded and broadcast on the ABC, and so the audio recordings that I'll be playing clips from today are from that world premiere in 2022. It was directed by Neil Armfield, composed by Joseph Twist, who's a Brisbane-based composer. The librettists were a pair, Christos Tsiolkas and Alana Valentine. Christos Tsiolkas, of course, is known for his novels as a novelist, particularly the book The Slap, if anybody's read that book or seen the film TV adaptation. And now all of the core creatives of this work identify as queer, which was part of the, maybe not mandate, but it was part of the commissioning process that queer people come together to tell this story of queer history. And these are the singers that we're going to hear.
Paul,
Yes.
what's the origin of the work? Was it commissioned by somebody, or is it Neil Armfield's pet project? Who got it up and running?
My understanding is that it was through Adelaide Festival, so that was a bunch of funding sources, as is often the case, state and federal funding, and it was sort of this central pillar of the Adelaide Festival in 2022. My understanding is that Neil Armfield was sort of one of the central figures as the director who wanted to tell this story, but there's also this side, we have the named creatives, but whenever you're looking at something like Adelaide Festival, you have the festival director who's artistic director of the festival, who maybe was sort of shopping around. I'm wondering now who the...
I think it was Neil Armfield.
Was the... Okay, right, there you go. Okay, thanks. That solves that a little bit, doesn't it? Looking for his own sort of project to work on. And then, so what I'll draw your attention to is the first cast member we have is the tenor Mark Oates, who I must admit I didn't know, apparently is quite known to Adelaide audiences. Maybe people here have seen Mark Oates perform. You'll hear a bit of him today, performing as a dual role of Duncan and Dunstan. I'll be honest, in my preparation for the show I started to get really annoyed that these two characters' names are so similar, because I just kept getting confused. Ian Duncan is the victim of the murder, Dr. Ian Duncan, and Don Dunstan was the South Australian Premier, and also he wasn't at first the Premier. What's the legal...
Attorney General.
Thank you, thank you. The Attorney General of South Australia before he was the Premier. And as I said, there were these two narratives to the show. One is about Ian Duncan, and the other, which is about gay rights law progressions through South Australia. So Mark Oates inhabits Don Dunstan as well as Duncan because of the intertwined nature, which is a really interesting dramaturgical decision to sort of capture these two characters together and see how they kind of influence one another. You start with Oates as Duncan, and around the initial murder, that being named a watershed moment to commence gay rights for Don Dunstan. The progress of gay rights leading to a re-investigation of the criminal case of Duncan, and then there's a bit of flow-on effect later on. There's some, Dunstan sort of, in his later career, makes additional comments as well. So you have this navigation. Now, I've only listened to the recording. There is a really beautiful dance element to this show, which I haven't seen. I've only sort of seen, I guess, in pictures. But there is an additional dance character who, from reading about the show, is also in some ways depicts the character of Ian Duncan. So I think even at times, maybe when Oates is playing Dunstan, if we look at just the sonic landscape of the show, Ian Duncan is performed by Mark Oates, but there is, in addition to that, a kind of more conceptual, slightly abstract dance character who is also representing Duncan at times. And then we have a character called the Lost Boy, who in this production is played by Ainsley Mellom. Now, the Lost Boy, I would also simply name as a narrator. The Lost Boy in the show becomes the witness that emerges later on in the 1980s to provide new details on the case, but also has this function of narrating the entire show. The show moves across a time span of nearly 15 years and involves quite a lot of content in terms of things moving through Parliament, bills, the investigation of the murder. The Adelaide Chamber Singers were also a featured part of this work. I'll talk a little bit more shortly about why the chorus is so present, and we have a number of soloists from the Adelaide Chamber Singers at times offering additional solo lines as sort of, I was going to say insignificant characters. That sounds a bit pejorative. I don't mean to say that they're insignificant, just that they have individual lines or comments to make as people in South Australia in terms of the plot of the show. Okay, let's talk now about some of the features of the show. The image that I have just behind is from that production, and these are the members of the Adelaide Chamber Singers inhabiting different characters. Oh, and I think we even had in this image here, you can see the aerial dancing character that moves in and out of depicting Ian Duncan and perhaps some other abstract elements. And so he's suspended.